Welcome to the 2020 Bauder Lecture. Good afternoon, or if you are joining us from across the pond in England, good evening. Welcome to this presentation of the 2020 Bauder Lecture presented live from both Cranbrook and London. My name is Greg Wittkopp, and I have the distinct pleasure of serving as the Director of Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research, the host of today's lecture. I am so excited to welcome you to today's talk with Brendan Cormier of the Victoria and Albert Museum, known to most as the V&A. But before we begin, I want to tell you a little bit more about Cranbrook, the Center for Collections and Research, and our rich relationship with cars. Publicly launched in 2012, the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research is all about Cranbrook's history and legacy. My colleagues and I are responsible for stewarding and sharing Cranbrook's remarkable architecture, including our 3 historic house museums, our cultural landscapes, including the Cranbrook Japanese Garden, the vast collections of Cranbrook archives, and our campus-wide collection of cultural properties, treasures like the fountains and gates and sculptures that make Cranbrook a destination for visitors from around the world. In short, we are Cranbrook's storytellers. Give me a moment here while I start to share my screen and bring up some great images. All right, how does that look to everybody out there in virtual land? I am speaking to you today from the magnificent library in Cranbrook House. This is the home of our founders, newspaper publishers, George and Ellen Booth, and remains the heart and soul of the campus today. So if the center is all about Cranbrook's history and legacy, what gives us the credentials to tell the story of the car this afternoon? What is the Cranbrook connection? First of all, we share an architect with the history of automobiles, especially here in Detroit. Cranbrook House, including this library, was designed by the Detroit architect Albert Kahn and built in 2017. In between Albert Kahn's career as the designer of Tudoresque manor homes, such as Cranbrook House, was quickly eclipsed by his career as the designer of the world's automobile factories, including the Highland Park plant where Henry Ford built the first Model Ts. This drawing of the Highland Park plant, created as part of an insurance appraisal, is in the collection of Cranbrook Art Museum. But at the moment, it is still hanging in the galleries of the V&A in London, one of 3 drawings that our speaker borrowed from Cranbrook for the exhibition that he will be discussing today, Cars Accelerating the Modern World. But the connections between Cranbrook and the car go much deeper. Let's take a walk across the campus and continue our conversation today, where the work of the Cranbrook Center for Collections and Research always begins. In the archives reading room, the DNA of Cranbrook is contained in the more than 1.5 million records and documents, photographs and negatives that form the collections of Cranbrook archives. It is here that the stories of Cranbrook are preserved. But stewardship and preservation are only part of our work. The other half is focused on synthesizing this information and sharing it with audiences like you around the world. The story that I would like to share with you today as an introduction to our speaker's lecture is one that I am calling The Automobile Invasion of Cranbrook. The phrase comes from the documentarian of Cranbrook, and I should add, the founder of Cranbrook Archives, the Booth's youngest son, Henry. In his history of Cranbrook, which is preserved in the archives, Henry Booth retrospectively wrote the following about an excursion that took place when he was 7 years old on May 14, 1904, a little more than 5 months after his parents bought the property that they named Cranbrook. Quoting Hendry, "The automobile invasion of Cranbrook began with a small scouting party in the Booth's new Winton. We had probably owned that maroon rear door touring car a week. So it is likely I had had at least one ride around the block before making this momentous trip over the corduroy surface of Saginaw Road and past 3 toll gates on the way to the new farm." In case Saginaw Road is not familiar to the Detroiters in the audience, it's because we know it today as none other than Woodward Avenue. With 3 boys in the Booth family, it did not take long for them, with or without the knowledge of mom and dad, to realize that the Winton, which they affectionately named the bus, was ideally suited for a little, shall we say, off-roading here at Cranbrook. Driving the bus up a hill in September of 1906 is the oldest of the 3 boys, an 18-year-old James Scripps Booth. But we'll come back to him in a minute. By the time Cranbrook House was built, the Booth's car got a little classier. Just 1 month after they moved into the house in June of 1908, the Booths bought a snazzy Pierce Arrow for the princely sum of $7,750. That's roughly 3 times more than what I paid for my first car in 1981, a used Mazda GLC silver with a manual transmission. The Booth's new car came with 2 bodies, a closed limousine body for the winter and a sports touring body for the summer, shown in this vintage photograph from the archives. A state-of-the-art crane mounted on an iron track bolted to the walls of Cranbrook House garage hoisted the 2 bodies on and off the Pierce Arrow as the weather and seasons changed. Imagine the Booth's delight if they had known that one day this feat could be accomplished by the flick of a switch on the dashboard. Of course, some things never change. 2 years later, in 1910, Ellen Booth, with her new daughter-in-law, Jean McLaughlin, and Ellen and George's youngest son, Henry, found themselves in this predicament in that same Pierce Arrow. And no, they were not traveling somewhere up north. This was just a few miles away from Cranbrook on that major thoroughfare that we know today as Laza Road. You can picture Michigan's soon-to-be governor, Chase Osborne, campaigning against his predecessor, Governor Fred Warner, with a stump speech in 1909 that promised to fix Michigan's roads. Indeed, some things never change. The year 1911 found the Booths in Europe. The entourage included 8 family members, including 4 of their 5 children. But they certainly knew how to travel in style. The entourage also included their chauffeur and no less than 2 of their automobiles, the Pierce Arrow and, in this photograph taken in England, their sportier Lazier Briarcliff. The seat on the running board that you can see of the Lazier was designed for the chauffeur when the master took the wheel. So remember the image of the 18-year-old James Scripps Booth off-roading at Cranbrook? He grows up to be an artist and an automobile engineer. In 1911, shortly after he and his wife, Jean, returned from the family trip to Europe, he assembled, purchased, or specifically made parts for a tandem-seated cycle car, which the driver operated from the rear. Power was carried to the back axle by exposed belts outside the body. Seated in the front of what he named the JB rocket is his financial backer, James Batterman, while James Booth drives in the rear. Conveniently, both men shared the same initials, JB, hence the title of the JB rocket. I might add that the prototype for this rocket is in the collection of the Henry Ford Museum in Dearborn. On the right is one of James Booth's murals, you saw it earlier, which he painted in 1914 on a wall, appropriately, in the Tower Garage at Cranbrook House. The scene is of a Grand Prix race in France. James followed his design for the rocket with what remains his most unusual design, the world's first large two-wheeled car, the Bauder. Conceived when James was just 20 years old and prototyped in 1913 when he was 25, the car/motorcycle was powered with the first V8 engine ever built in Detroit, preceding Cadillac's famous V8 by a year. While the Bauder never went into commercial production, the model attracted wide interest, and in 1946 won a first award at the Automobile Golden Jubilee. I love this image showing James Booth in the Bauder on Woodward Avenue in Highland Park, heading north on his way to Cranbrook, surrounded by a gathering of awestruck boys and young men. Feels like a typical Saturday afternoon on Woodward Avenue today, if not the dream cruise in August. Although this is just the beginning of James Booth's career as an automobile engineer, let's leave his story behind and fast forward to the years following World War II. We are now in the grounds of the General Motors Technical Center, which of course was designed by Cranbrook's own Eero Saarinen. With Harley Earl, the vice president in charge of the design and styling department, GM was not only the largest corporation in the world, but one that had used contemporary architecture and design to define its brand. Before he retired in 1958, Earl was not only instrumental in helping to secure Saarinen as the architect of its Technical Center campus, but arguably won the competition to design the car with the most audacious tail fins, the 1959 Cadillac. Harley Earl's team included 10 women, 6 shown here, the so-called damsels of design, 3 of whom studied at Cranbrook Academy of Art: Jane Van Alstyne, Jerry Kavanaugh, and Susan Vanderbilt. Although Susan Vanderbilt lamented that they were always la femmes, or the female designers, she is celebrated for designs such as this door frame for a Pink Panther car. It makes you wonder what she would have designed if GM had allowed her and the other damsels of design to move beyond the confines of designing the automobile's interior to the male-dominated realm of the car's body. In 1990, Vanderbilt donated her papers and drawings to Cranbrook Archives. We, in turn, gladly loaned 2 of them to the V&A, including this one for their cars exhibition. My story ends where it began, on the grounds of Cranbrook House. Over the years, we have been the location for more than a few photo shoots, including this one for the 1960 Cadillac V, with its audacious tail fins, a legacy of Harley Earl. The lecture this afternoon, the 4th in the annual Bauder Lecture Series, is supported through an endowment established by longtime supporters of Cranbrook educational community, Cranbrook President Emeritus Lillian Bauder and her late husband, Donald Bauder. Dr. Lillian Bauder served as Cranbrook's President and Chief Executive Officer from 1983 to 1996, a 13-year period during which she not only developed, but ultimately led to the creation of Cranbrook's signature contemporary buildings through the community-wide strategic plans that she implemented. These buildings included the Vlasic Early Childhood Center, the Williams Natatorium, the Academy of Arts new studios building, and the expansion of the Institute of Science. In 1996, Dr. Bauder became Vice President of Masco Corporation, a position she held until she retired in 2007. 7 years later, Dr. Bauder was named a recipient of Cranbrook's prestigious Founders Award. Dr. Bauder now resides in Columbia, Maryland, but continues her personal dedication to Cranbrook as demonstrated by several endowments that she established, including the center's Bauder Lecture. Lillian, we are indebted to you for your generosity and your never-ending passion for Cranbrook's people, program, and place. Thank you for all you do to help the center bring these stories to life. Whether we are welcoming you to Cranbrook virtually or in person, I have an amazing team of board members and colleagues working with me to shape the mission and program of the center. A special thank you to our board chair, Beth Willoughby, and her team of committee members. Working with Cranbrook's president, Dominic DeMarco, you helped the center move mountains this year. I also want to thank just 5 of my colleagues: Head Archivist Deborah Rice, Curator Kevin Atkinson, Associate Archivist Laura McNewman, Registrar Leslie Mayo, and working with all of us, Administrative Assistant Alyssa Seelman-Rutkowski. You are all amazing. Thank you for all you do. And to all of you in the audience today, thank you for joining us on this and the center's many other adventures. While many of you have become Zoom experts in the last 3 months, a few reminders. Because we are using Zoom's webinar platform, your cameras have been turned off and your mics have been muted. At the end of our speaker's presentation, we hope you will be able to join us for a live Q&A session. To ask a question, use the button at the bottom of your screen where you can type and send it to me. Depending on how much time we have, I will share some of the most pertinent questions with our speaker. If you still have questions at the end of the presentation, feel free, as always, to email them to us at center@cranbrook.edu. It is now my pleasure to welcome to this virtual stage, live from his home in London, Brendan Cormier. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Greg. And thank you for that wonderful intro. There's so much.
Let me share just a little bit more with them, okay? So that you don't have to do it. Brendan is a senior design curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum, again, known simply to all of us as the V&A, and a co-curator with Esme Hawes of the exhibition Cars Accelerating the Modern World. From 2014 to 2017, he was the lead curator of the V&A Gallery at the Design Society in Shenzhen, China. In 2016, he curated the first pavilion of applied arts at the Venice Biennale with an exhibition called A World of Fragile Parts. Prior to working at the V&A, Brendan was the managing editor of Volume magazine. All right, Brendan, now this is your opportunity to take it away and tell us all about cars.
Thanks so much. Well, I'll just dive into the presentation then, but that was a wonderful intro. And I find that there's never a limit to the amount of facts and kinds of automobiles one encounters, and you've introduced me to a few others that I've never heard of. So that was great. So I usually begin my presentations about this exhibition with a few kind of preamble questions and answers. The first obvious one being, why would the V&A be doing a show about cars right now? well, now not technically because the show is over, but when we were presenting it and preparing it, that was a predominant question. And the simple answer is because what we feel at the moment, and what many people are thinking, is that the car stands at a kind of critical turning point in terms of its design, in terms of major questions about its sustainability, and also in terms of changes in consumer habits and general shifts towards alternative modes of mobility. So there's a lot of questions floating in the air right now about what the future of the automobile is. Although we would have loved the show to be a show about telling everybody what the future of the car is. Unfortunately, if I could tell you what the future of the car is, I probably wouldn't be a curator at the museum. I'd be busy trying to make a lot of money with those ideas. No, that's not really the strength of what a museum can do. A museum, it's primarily a space for talking about contemporary issues and using history to contextualize those issues. And so that's exactly what we wanted to do. We wanted to think about, what kind of stories can we bring up from the past to make the big questions about the future of mobility more grounded in history. So that was the idea. The next question that we normally get is, why would the V&A do such a show about cars? So the V&A has never done in its 165-year history a show about the automobile, which on one hand is a little bit strange considering that the V&A calls itself a museum of design, and the car is obviously a piece of design. But there's also a very kind of simple explanation for that, which is that around the beginning of the 20th century, the V&A and our neighbors across the street, the Science Museum, were one museum. And the collections became so unwieldy, so large, that they decided that it would be best for them to split and to have two different focuses, one on science and technology and the other on applied arts. So the story is, in this great separation, the Science Museum took all the cars and we were left with the dinner service. But more and more today we talk about, let's say, the blurring between what is a piece of technology and what is a piece of design. We all have one of these beautiful phones probably in our pocket. And when we talk about them as designed objects as much as advanced pieces of technology. And of course, that's the same with the car. So the V&A doing a show like this, in a way, it's an effort to kind of claw back the design narrative of the car. The other thing that I always have to kind of warn people about, that's too strong a word, but prepare people for, is that unlike what you might expect with most car exhibitions, this isn't a show, or most exhibitions about car design, this isn't a show that will look at the 100 most beautiful car designs of the past century. What we were more interested in is talking about and unpacking the idea of how a car, or how a piece of design, in this case a car, has agency in the world. And the car, unlike any other piece of design, this is what we argue, has had the most agency in that it's impacted the world in more ways than any other singular piece of design. And so that became a very handy way of kind of framing the show, simply because the topic is so vast, that we would look at the car through the metaphor of an agent of change, and try to pinpoint exactly where those changes took place in the history. So we've divided the show into 3 sections, as one always needs to do, to kind of create some clarity, come up with some thematic differentiations. And those are very broad and very sweeping. And we've likely left out, tons and tons of subject matter that we could have touched on. But for us, this worked. It was divided into 3 sections. So the first, and I'll go through them one by one, was about how the initial promise of speed was the attraction and allure of the car, and was the kind of original selling point of the car, which drove the industry. And in the middle section, we'd look at the whole manufacturing side of the car, and the innovations and revolutions introduced into the world through the challenge of how one can scale up such a complicated invention. And the third, what we'll talk about is, what we see in this fabulous Edward Bertinsky photograph of Los Angeles, is the enormous worldwide impact of the car on shaping the space around us. So I've also peppered this presentation with some images of what the show looked like before it closed. You can imagine actually that when we closed, everything was put under Tyvek. So all of this is actually still here at the museum, you know, carefully being looked after by our security guards and sheltered under Tyvek, waiting for the all clear sign to be able to return these objects. Unfortunately, we had to close the exhibition about early by 1 month because of COVID-19, but we were still able, fortunately, I'm very thankful we were able to show this for 4 months at the V&A. So here's our typically grandiose super graphic of cars. So we start with this idea. We wanted to start the show with trying to look at what the ambition of the car is. And we wanted to look at the ambition through the lens of how we've dreamed up the car in science fiction imagery. And this is an image that actually we never ended up finding the original to, but was a very provocative image that was circulating on the internet a few years ago, looking at how, as early as the 1950s and the 1960s, notions of autonomous driving were already being proposed. And we find real evidence of that, of course, in Detroit. And the car below at the bottom of the screen here is the first Firebird from General Motors, the first of 4 designs, 3 realized. And throughout history, what we found was so interesting, whether you're in Soviet Russia, pre-Soviet Russia, whether you're in 19th century France, whether you're in Japan in the 1960s or Italy in the 1960s, you have all this different publication material being put out trying to imagine what the future of the car might look like. And there's one kind of leitmotif that goes through all of this, which is this notion of the car dreaming of being essentially an airplane, dreaming of flight. So it's this notion of fast, frictionless mobility that we find so compelling and that we've repeated worldwide through these images. And so we were delighted when we went to Detroit a couple of years ago and were able to visit GM and see their heritage fleet of automobiles and see, of course, this pristine looking, immaculately preserved Firebird 1. As I mentioned, you know, this dream of trying to become a plane is literally kind of mimicked here in the shape of this automobile. Looking, you know, this is right after World War II, this is the 1950s. And Harley Earl, the designer that Greg mentioned earlier, is taking obvious cues from aeronautics industry, and the car even has a jet engine in the back. More interesting, as I referenced that image earlier that we couldn't find the original of, is this promotional piece that you see above the Firebird 2, and it's this fantastically kitschy advertisement where this family in the 1950s imagines what it might be like to transport themselves to 20 years into the future, to the glorious futuristic decade of the 1970s. And here's a radio control tower operator getting them onto this new fancy highway, which will allow them to drive without a driver. So imagining again what autonomous driving might look like, you know, more than half a century ago. And this is what the picture gallery looked like of all the images that we were putting together. So this notion of fast, frictionless, free mobility was an incredibly compelling idea. And we have evidence of that throughout the 20th century. But what's interesting is the beginning, you know, if we go back to the very beginning of the automobile, it wasn't such a fast beginning. And there were many other things that could go much faster. So we have here from the Science Museum across the street, a Benz Patent Motorwagen 3. It's the first kind of commercially sold automobile in the history, although, you know, as with many things, kind of what is the first car is often highly debated. But this was certainly an important one, if not the most important one, because it became the reference point for future car design, and it couldn't go very fast. But there is a story here about Carl Benz's wife, Bertha Benz, whose money was borrowed apparently to start his company, and had a very strong interest in the company doing well. And so seeing that there needed to be some publicity, she organized a publicity stunt where she took the car on the first ever road trip from Mannheim to Pforzheim. It was about 100 kilometers. It took from dawn to dusk. It required incredible ingenuity on her part to be able to repair the engine. She had a cobbler install brakes, and she needed to get gasoline from the local drugstore. And so it was really a test of endurance. But this test of endurance was incredibly compelling at the beginning, at the end of the 19th century. And so there arose very quickly a subculture of automobile enthusiasts who weren't using cars to go from home to work and back to home again, but we're really using these things as a new form of leisure, a fancy new form of leisure. And we see this reflected in early photography from the late 19th century and early 20th century, including, this is one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century, Jacques-Henri Lartigue, shooting the Grand Prix in Dieppe. And he shoots this when he's just a teenager, and it becomes one of the most famous photographs of the 20th century. And on the right, we have this photography from Andrew Pitcairn Knowles, documenting kind of bourgeois society at the beginning of the 20th century and showing off their cars. Here's a little setup there. It was also important for us to kind of unravel and unearth maybe stories that had been slightly forgotten. And one of those stories was the role of early women drivers and women racers in that race culture. And so in the UK, we have this place called Brooklands, and Brooklands is the first ever private motor racing track devoted solely for motor cars. It is invented at the beginning of the 20th century because the UK government installs this kind of universal speed limit on all roads in the UK. Nothing can go faster than 20 miles an hour. Therefore, you need a private track. And what we had in the collection is this poster in the middle. And what drew us to the poster was this, obviously in bold, all cap type down at the bottom, ladies race. And the reason there were ladies races, well, it almost didn't happen. But when races first started taking off in the last decade of the 20th century, you saw men and women racing in the same competitions. And that's a little bit of a story about any new technology, really. So when a new technology is introduced, it opens up a temporary gap in the prevalent norms of the time. There are no pre-existent rules about what men and women should do and what their roles are with the automobile. And so a few women step up and they take part in these races. Well, eventually those gaps close. And they were closing at the time of the opening of Brooklands. And so it became this hotly debated issue whether or not women should be able to race. They ended up being able to race in separate competitions. And on the right, you'll see a picture of one of the major figures of that race that we found in the National Portrait Gallery, Jill Scott Thomas. And it's also interesting to look at how quickly, you know, this starts to captivate public audiences, but it also, this notion of designing a car to go ever faster also starts to captivate notions of national identity, national progress, nationalism overall. And one of the most interesting posters I came across in the research was this middle poster that you see here from the Empire Marketing Board, Britain's a kind of propaganda division of the British government that initially was advertising the strength of its empire. And compelling people to buy products from the empire. And here you see a very kind of Donald Trumpian statement being put forward, which is Britain first, always buy British. And in the background, you see the poster kind of flaunting the technological advancements, including the recently won land speed record from the Golden Arrow in the 1920s. This story is repeated over and over and over again amongst all nations. Every nation wants to be the proud owner of the fastest car. And so one of the cars we have in the exhibition is Delahaye, which is known as the million-franc Delahaye, because in 1937, the French government, concerned that the Germans were winning all the Grand Prix, which itself was a French invention, they put out a 1 million franc prize to anybody who could design a car fast enough to beat the Germans. And this was the car that did it. And there she is in the show. And above on that large screen, you see footage from Brooklands being played. And now that Tatra you see on the right is also a very special car because it's the first time this kind of notion of speed and the way it starts to shape the development of the car really starts to shape the exterior look of the car. So most of the development of the car up until that point for reasons of speed is taking place under the hood. But by the 1920s and 1930s, you see the introduction of this notion of streamlining. Streamlining, again, coming from the aeronautics industry by this fellow on the bottom right here, Paul Jarret, who in the 1920s goes from car company to car company trying to sell the idea of streamlined cars. So an incredibly efficient body of a car that reduces air friction. And it's only the Czech company Tatra by the 1930s who take him up on his offer. And him, together with Hans Ludwinka, come up with this fabulous design for the Tatra 77. That also, though, quickly kind of captivates the imagination of product designers, especially American product designers in the 1920s and 1930s. And this is one of my favorite, let's say, information designs of the 20th century, is by Raymond Louis, who is this very famous French-American industrial designer, one of the first ever industrial designers. And he comes up with this evolution of design chart, he calls it. And here he looks at, on the left, we see obviously how automobiles are evolving to become more streamlined and more efficient. He applies that later to trains. And so we see the shape of trains also becoming more efficient. But, and here's the funny part, he says, you know what, actually streamlining is the aesthetic of the future and it should be applied to absolutely everything, including telephones, clocks, chairs, and people's bodies. And so that we find direct reflection in the 1930s in this streamlining craze. And so from the automobile, we see streamlining get applied to all sorts of things. And one of the funniest objects that we have in the Viennese collection that obviously doesn't make much sense to be streamlined is this meat slicer at the bottom. And I was just so thrilled, having known about this object in the collection, that I finally had a reason to put it out on display. So obviously we see this public fascination with speed. We see it build the market. We see race culture grow and grow. And by the 1960s, the big three automobile makers in Detroit, they were in need of a new invention. They were in need of some kind of new model to get people excited about their cars again. As Greg mentioned, you know, the tail fin had kind of gone to its furthest logical conclusion by the end of the 1950s. And so they looked to Europe and they saw how incredibly well European sports cars were doing. They saw how those sports cars were starting to take over the American market. And so it was both GM and Ford at the same time, more or less, coming up with ideas to market a relatively affordable car, not very sturdy in its construction, but with an incredibly powerful motor under the hood. And here we saw the birth of the muscle car, and we saw cars like the Pontiac GTO, and of course the Ford Mustang. And we also saw this new generation of kind of brooding anti-hero, and the Ford Mustang was popularized by Steve McQueen in Bullitt, of course. And we were the reason I have this Judge car here is because originally we were going to actually take that car because it was also at GM. And as curating goes, sometimes you make last minute swaps. And in order to save a little bit of money, we found a local Ford Mustang and put it in instead. So if you want a little behind the scenes story of some curating, it can be all about the budget sometimes. So we have these ever more powerful cars, and of course we also have an increasing amount of road accidents. And so one of the most curious kind of contradictions with the automobile is we've designed this thing that arguably kills more people than any other designed object. And so the question is, once you've designed an object that can do harm to people, how do you go about solving that? And early responses to road safety really centered around not the car itself and the design of the car being inherently problematic, but it was really centered around the idea of the drivers, and that in order to have safer roads, you had to have better drivers. And so what we see is early safety campaigns really focused on that. You know, posters like "Obey the speed limit" and "Read up on your highway code." But curiously enough, nobody was blaming the design of the car until you get to the 1960s and you get to a young lawyer at the time, Ralph Nader, deciding to look into this increasing number of cases of fatalities. And so he writes this expose It's really targeted towards the big three in Detroit. And it says some very mean things about them. And this book itself might not have taken off unless GM hadn't hired spies to try and honey trap Ralph Nader, which he reveals to the New York Times. The New York Times writes a big piece about it, and everybody wants to read this book. And the rest is history. And by history, I mean a massive shift in consumer regulations being put forward towards cars. Post 1960s, we see the introduction of mandatory seat belts. We see the introduction later on ABS brakes. And the design of the car from the 1970s onwards is really increasingly focused on safety as much as it is on making cars go fast. Now, you might be wondering who this gruesome character on the right is. His name is Graham. And in our interest to show how people have communicated the need for safety, this is one of the most extreme examples. It's by an artist named Patricia Piccinini from Australia. And here she imagines what a human being might look like had they evolved to naturally survive a car crash. So he is horrific by design. He's meant to kind of gross you out. He's got an expanded cranium full of fluid in order to protect the brain. He has a series of nipples on his chest, which all inflate to become airbags. He has no neck and he has no ankles because those are the two most fragile parts of the body in a car crash. And there you have it. He was singularly the most enjoyable thing for all the children to see when they came into the exhibition. So if we know that, you know, the idea of speed was an incredibly lucrative one, the idea of putting you know, the driver behind the steering wheel and giving them the freedom and the agency to go at speeds that had never gone before. The next big challenge was, how do you take this very complicated piece of machinery and scale it up so that you can make a lot of them and you can make them affordable so that a lot of people can buy them. And again, here we have the classic story of Henry Ford and the moving assembly line, which is the story that most people have heard before. So we wanted to kind of contextualize that a bit more and unpack kind of what it meant to introduce the Model T, which was the result of the moving assembly line, and what kind of changes were needed. First, again, it's a story about design, that all design and innovation comes from a time and a place. And Detroit is in the Midwest, and the Midwest is surrounded by a lot of abattoirs and meatpacking plants. And so the primary inspiration for the assembly line, in which parts move along a track and people repeat one singular act, actually comes from a disassembly line. So from the abattoir, where animals come in whole and are slowly moved around and chopped up into their respective bits. And this is one of my favorite moments of stage setting, is to hang a pig carcass above a Ford Model T. I'm very proud of it. The exhibition manager who had to source the pig carcass was a little bit challenged with that request, but she was able to find a plastic version at the Tower of London who had some in their stock. So there it is. But it's not just about the idea of the moving assembly line. Once you start to make millions of cars, you need all sorts of different elements to manage that production flow. And one of them, as Greg showed already, is new architecture. So Albert Kahn was really in the right place at the right time to become the most prolific architecture of the 20th century by shifting a large part of his practice towards factory making. He designs Highland Park, as well as many, many other factories for Ford and others in Detroit and across America. And this absolutely stunning drawing comes from Cranbrook itself. But you also need, now that you have thousands and thousands of new employees, new ways of managing their production. And so Ford installs this notion of the sociological department, where this group of bureaucrats would oversee the workers and make sure that they were living upright, respectable lives in order to earn their $5 a day wage. You also need to come up with whole new ways of sourcing your materials. And so the most extreme example here is Fordlandia. It's a piece of the Amazon rainforest that Henry Ford bought that's roughly the size of Northern Ireland. Unfortunately, I don't know what a good American kind of comparison is, but one can say it's relatively large. And he buys this piece of the Amazon rainforest simply to get in an attempt to source cheaper rubber for his production, because at that time, the 1930s, the British had a monopoly on rubber, primarily coming from Southeast Asia. And so you just see these incredible lengths that the car companies are going into in order to mass produce. And this is just an image from the show. What's really interesting, though, is that when the moving assembly line is introduced in 1913, 1 year later, Henry Ford decides to open it up to the public so people can come and visit and witness the spectacle of mass production. And what happens here is actually quite a lot of Europeans end up making a kind of pilgrimage to Detroit to see the miracle of modern production. And so we start to see in Europe a lot of inspiration coming more or less directly from what's taking place in Detroit and what's taking place at car manufacturing plants. So we see Le Corbusier, this image on the right, by 1920, he's saying, you know, if all cars can be manufactured in a mass assembled way, then certainly architecture can. And so he starts dreaming up ways for mass produced homes. And this is his first one called the Maison Citroën after the car company. We see in the middle, these are two examples of Bauhaus furniture being produced. Bauhaus famously kind of moves or pushes for a new machine-like aesthetic where all objects should be stripped of ornament, also use kind of basic materials like tubular steel. And on the left, you see a design put out by an Italian designer in the 1910s named Tayat. He comes up with this notion. He was a futurist, and he had this idea that all people should be wearing this kind of idea of the boiler suit or the jumpsuit. And he publishes the plans in the Italian newspaper so that everybody can make one. And the next day, there's a rush on fabric. So you see this enthusiasm manifest itself everywhere. You see it also manifest itself in standardization. So in the show, we feature images from Frank and Lillian Gilbreth, who are famous for doing time and motion studies. The Frankfurt kitchen is another interesting object in the 1920s. It's the first object kind of designed to make work at home more efficient. So thinking about the paths one takes and the motions one does in a kitchen and trying to rationalize that into a modernist form. And sorry, let me just go here. But what's interesting is all of this kind of rationalization of labor comes at a cost. And so what I don't have in this presentation, but we feature in the exhibition, is a letter from 1914 from the wife of an assembly line worker. And it's written and addressed to Henry Ford. And it's talking about the psychological and physical duress that her husband has been put under since the introduction of the assembly line. And so in a way, this kind of shift from highly skilled labor to de-skilled repetitive labor, again, led by the automobile industry, has forced a new conversation in the 20th century about labor rights. And so we were very fortunate to be able to visit the Walter Reuther Library and Archives in Detroit. And we have a series of posters that we've taken from there, which really set the tenor for a lot of labor discussions that are still ongoing today. So one of the posters that we have, you see in the top left here, which is fight automation fallout with fewer hours of work and no loss in pay. And this is really not too far away from what we're talking about today in terms of the great threat of automation and how we're going to reorganize society when so much labor is automated. And so notions of universal basic income are not that far off the bat. And on the right here, we have this fabulous one-armed bandit robot, as it was called, the Unimate, which is the first ever robot that was used on a factory floor. A lot of people would be surprised to hear that robots were being used in car factories as early as the 1960s. And the Henry Ford Museum has that first one, which we were very lucky to be able to bring over to London. And here's just another view of that set up there. So once you are able to sell millions of cars, you also have to come up with new techniques. Sorry, let me rephrase that. Once you're able to make 1 million of cars, you also have to come up with new ways of being able to sell them. And so we switched the conversation really from the Henry Ford story to the General Motors and Alfred Sloan story. At the beginning of the 20th century, we kind of switch over, away from the everyman's car of the Ford Model T to this smaller but very important industry of luxury automobiles. And what we see are companies like Hispano-Suiza, Rolls-Royce, doing very well in terms of marketing incredibly expensive crafted cars to the 1%. And we see that manifested in ideas like René Lalique, who's the most famous glass maker of his time in the 1910s, making glass hood ornaments for cars, which you see at the bottom. You see entire new fashions emerge, motoring fashions. And if you flip through magazines like Vogue in the 1920s and 1930s, you see the car starting to be inserted into the pages, the advertisement pages, as a new kind of apparel that one needs to wear. So you have to have the perfect outfit, you have to have the perfect luggage, and you have to have this perfect outer shell, which is your car. So that was doing very well. On the other hand, nobody could compete with the Ford Model T. It was simply too cheap, and nobody could come up with a cheaper alternative. So as I mentioned, Alfred Sloan, by the end of the 1910s, he comes up with this idea. He says, you know what, why is it that in Paris every year there are 4 seasons and people feel compelled to buy a new outfit every season? And why can't we have that with automobiles? He starts to experiment with the possibilities of applying color to cars. One thing that often gets left out of the story about Henry Ford's any color you like so long as it's black saying is that black was the color of choice because it was the fastest drying color. So it's not until we get these new color samples by Duco, which are fast drying color samples or colors, paints, that we get the possibility for a mass manufactured, mass produced product that can come in different color varieties. So Alfred Sloan jumps on that right away. He brings in Harley Earl. Harley Earl goes on to become, probably the most famous car designer of the 20th century. And in their first attempts to kind of think about the way they can use color and thinking about luxury, they actually employ dazzle ship painters who were creating camouflage boats at that time, give them these new paints, and essentially ask them, can you disguise these factory-made cars to look like something different? They introduce annual models, different color options, and this really catapults GM into first place as the leading car manufacturer of the 20th century at that time. And there's the LaSalle, the first so-called designed car from the art and color section of GM, which is the first design department of GM. As Greg mentioned earlier, you also start to see, as the century progresses, an observation that cars need to be marketed to different demographics, different points of society, and the observation that actually women are incredible buying force in terms of the decision-making of what cars get bought. And so, it is debated and argued slightly. Damsels of Design was definitely used as a lot of PR, but it is an indication of a kind of an attempt to bring women into what was a very male-dominated industry. And so Suzanne Vanderbilt, whose drawings we were able to show, she's one of the few of the damsels of design who don't end up leaving out of probable disgust, out of the rampant sexism that's in the car industry at the time, and works her way up the company. The other kind of contradiction here is that you see this car being sold. You see the car becoming, let's say by the 1950s, 1960s, a way of kind of fitting into society. So everybody needs a house, they need a car, and it's a way of conforming to the ideas and norms of society. But by the 60s especially, you start to see the car actually playing a different role, which is as a canvas for self-expression and for the creation of kind of new group identities. And so you see a kind of pushing back of what the big 3 automobile makers are saying in the 1950s especially, and a look at alternatives. So one of those is the famous advertising campaign from Volkswagen Volkswagen emerging from 1945 and never changing itself. So it's completely bucking the trend of the annual model that GM was talking about. And they play with this joke that they never change and they never style their cars in this advertising campaign. But we also have this amazing middle section where we've created 5 different short films that look at different subcultures around the world and how each of them were able to use the car to kind of subvert what the original message of the car was and use the car towards their own means and their own uses of self-expression. And so that car at the back is an amazing converted lowrider from Thomas Vasquez that we borrowed, and he features in one of these films. So finally, because I know I'm pushing the time slightly, we get to the end section, which is about shaping space. And here we wanted to kind of backtrack a little bit because we wanted to talk about the question of why the gas engine, the petrol engine, the internal combustion engine became the dominant mode of propulsion technology used by cars. So at the end of the 20th century, there were actually 3 different kinds of motors being used in cars. You had steam motors, which were, fairly unreliable and dangerous, but you also had electric engines, which were doing quite well in the races. You had several land speed records being won by electric motors. So the question is, why did the electric car disappear for almost a century and gas-powered cars become the dominant mode? And one of the answers we could come up with, well, that many people have said, is that it was all, again, like the problem that we have today, which was range. And so in coming up with ways to sell the automobile at the beginning of the 20th century, you could sell the idea of speed and the thrill of speed, but you could also sell the idea of freedom, and freedom to be able to go vast distances. And this is what we see happening a lot in car companies and tire companies at the beginning of the 20th century, selling the idea of going on a road trip. And so this fabulous beast that we have here in the top left of the screen is a car that is designed by Citroën in the 1920s. And 8 of these cars are designed, and they're designed specifically to cross all of Africa in this exposition called La Croisière Noire. And so, as you can see in the map in the right, it goes from the south of France all the way to Madagascar. And they bring a photographer with them and a filmmaker, and they collect objects, and it ends with the show, an exhibition at the Louvre. And so again, it's an incredibly calculated attempt by Citroën to say, hey, what can a car do? It can turn you into a world explorer. And companies like Michelin do this as well. They come up with this world atlas of road conditions that we've brought 150 of these glass negatives to the V&A to look at. And clothing companies like Burberry, as you can see, this kind of great tunic on the right, preparing you for your intrepid off-road adventure. And there it is in the exhibition, and we don't have it open here, but what I found was wonderful, even though this thing looks like a clunker and it's a heavy kind of metallic beast, the French still like to travel in style, so it has Louis Vuitton luggage in the back. So we see the popularization of the internal combustion engine. And then, of course, next to that, we see this incredible acceleration of the oil industry and extraction. And so we see literally new kind of world powers emerge, new geopolitics kind of taking shape that we've been living with for the last 20th century, for the last century. What I was more interested in was some of the more extreme measures we've taken to kind of find oil. And one of those is this proposition at the right after World War II, which was looking at the use of atomic bombs to blow up large pieces of earth in order to access hard to get to oil. And one of those, me being Canadian, I was particularly horrified, was a real proposal to drop a nuclear bomb on the Alberta oil sands in the 1950s that was thankfully halted. But it's also important to remember that, our fascination with our extraction of oil started from a relatively naive place. Oil was really seen as a miracle material. And this is reflected in a lot of objects and paperwork from the past. In our collection, we have this amazing tourist brochure from Baku in Azerbaijan from the 1930s, where they say, come to Baku. The city is somewhere far off in the distance, but look at, you know, the beauty of our oil rig. Isn't it fantastic? We see a whole slew of new plastics. Again, plastics we're a little bit iffy about today, but in the 1950s, they really were a miracle material, as expressed in the notion of the Tupperware party. And this is one of the most fantastic kind of documents that we were able to get our hands on. This is an advertisement from Life magazine from the 1960s, where the advertisers, you know, not yet aware of the effects of global warming, decide that the best way to relate the incredible amount of energy humble oil produces is to compare it to the melting of glaciers. So that one hasn't held up very well in time. So we inevitably look at this kind of nearing crisis of the end of oil or reaching peak oil. And again, we can find in history really interesting examples of how we've tried to overcome that. We have a Messerschmitt in the show, the emergence of bubble cars, in part a reaction to the Suez Canal crisis and a spike in oil prices. The Ford Nucleon, again, this obsession with nuclear power, a concept car that was hoping that one day nuclear energy could be brought down in size so that it could fit in the trunk of your car. And of course, a big shock to the system in the 1970s with the OPEC oil crisis. And finally, we look in the show at the role of the automobile in nation building. And so the automobile emerges as a technology around the same time as nation states do. And so we see the clearest manifestation of the car being used as a nation builder with the Volkswagen, a product by the Nazi regime of Germany and Adolf Hitler, who believed that, you know, everybody should have a car. Oddly enough, not because it was a great mobility option, but because he was so fond of the countryside and he wanted everybody to be able to get out to the countryside, which he felt was the purest expression of the German soul. We see also the emergence of the notion of tourism and traveling by car and cultural heritage merging together to create kind of the image of certain nations. So Stonehenge is featured in this Shell ad, in a series of Shell ads. They advertise the ability to travel the country and see all the great images and great cultural heritage of Britain with your car. The Michelin Guide is another great example. They literally invent the idea of the road trip through their guide in 1900. And by the 1950s, you see Fiat coming up with the Fiat Seicento Multipla, a tool to kind of pack your whole family into the car and go on a road trip around Italy. To do that, you need a whole new set of infrastructure, and so highway building campaigns figures into that prominently. The notion of the highway starting simultaneously in America, but as a kind of concerted kind of grand notion in Italy in the 1920s, but then being applied for the first time really with the Autobahn project in the 1930s in Germany, and later with the national system of interstate and defense highways. And so you see all this kind of energy going into kind of building a nation through motorizing a nation. And today, even still, we have this idea that there are certain kind of national characteristics reflected in what our cars look like. So we can kind of intuitively sense what an Italian car might look like versus an American car versus a British car. The irony of all this is that, you know, although it's an incredibly potent tool for national identity, automobiles are also one of the preeminent globalized objects in that their present day manufacture, and even historically the way they've been manufactured, have operated on an incredibly kind of globalized dynamics of supply chains, outsourcing factories to different parts of the world. And so we see here a really interesting brochure from the 1970s from Chrysler, where at the bottom right, we have this car, which you can't read right here, but is actually this car, which is the Paycon. which we also show in the exhibition. And the Paykan is Iran's national car. It emerges in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. It's actually a retrofitted Hillman Hunter. So it becomes this potent national symbol in Iran. It comes from Britain. It's bought out by Chrysler. And you see how kind of complicated the back of house reality of car ownership and production actually is, even though on the surface of it, it's an incredibly potent national symbol. And so we see this globalization here in this one chart that we kind of end the show with. It's too small to kind of read here, but what I can show you, or the main kind of message here, is that at the beginning of the history of cars, we have many, 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 many small workshops. And over time, they all merge into a handful of massive multinational corporations controlling kind of the production of cars today. So to end, you know, there's this niggly problem of, so that's all nice and good, but what is the future? And even though I tried as hard as possible not to mention the future, my colleagues at the V&A insisted that we have a car. And when I told them that there were options for flying cars out there, they said, definitely let's include a flying car. Now, the problem with doing anything about the future is that it takes 2 years to put on an exhibition. And usually by the time the exhibition opens, whatever kind of fancy futuristic project you thought of including, it ends up getting canceled. And that's exactly what happened with this car. It's called the Pop-Up Next by Ital Design and Audi and Airbus. And as we were installing it, the designers informed me that the project had been canceled. But it is still a fantastic project and design concept, if not probably unrealistic in its execution. It consists of a chassis, a pod, and a quadricopter. And the idea here is that you would rent the car, you would call it up, and depending on whether it could go on the road or had to fly, the quadricopter would pick it up or it would go on the chassis. And so that was really interesting. And we didn't want to just end with that, but we wanted to end with some kind of concluding space of reflection. So I'll show you an install shot. That's what it looks like there. And that screen, we created a film in which we kind of trawled the internet for video clips to create this collage. And the collage was intended in 5 minutes to create this narrative where we talk about, in the different ways the car has created this notion of an original promise. So whether that be the freedom of the open road, or frictionless fluid speed, or even in the notion of the way we make cars, you know, automation and the ability to make millions and millions of things, and how each of those original promises ends up with an unintended consequence. So that be traffic, congestion, pollution, sprawl, and all these things that we need to now overcome. And so what is the role of the designer today? The role of the designer today in that cycle is to, again, address those consequences with new solutions. And you can probably get where I'm going. You know, after those new solutions, there will be unintended consequences, and on it goes. And so that is the car, and that's the end of the show. And we were very happy to do it. So that's also the end of that presentation. So I'll stop sharing my screen now, I think.
Thank you, Brendan. I think we're both on the screen again now. I wish that we could all stand up and give you a warm round of applause. Well, we could do that, but you wouldn't necessarily hear it. What I really enjoyed about this is, I mean, here in Metro Detroit, certainly, we spend a lot of time thinking about the automobile. And I think your whole project, the catalog, is one that offers a perspective that's a little bit different from what we often are hearing and thinking here in the US, and in particular in Detroit. To start these questions, and again, I would invite everybody in the audience to start typing away. I know that a few of you may end up drifting off the Zoom webinar here, but for those of you that still want to stay on, please start sending your questions. And while you're doing that, I would like you to just reflect a little bit more on, you know, maybe what the car means to the average person in England, London, compared to what you have experienced in Detroit, and hey, throw in Detroit, Toronto, where you have family as well, if you like. So let's start there.
Well, I mean, I think the quick answer is it means more or less the same. It's, you know, and that's quite remarkable about the power of the automobile, was that, you know, these kind of promises of the sense of agency, freedom and thrill have been such incredibly lucrative notions that the car has managed to become a global phenomenon. And so if you were to ask a family in Kuala Lumpur why they bought a car or own a car, and ask a family in Cape Town and ask a family in Buenos Aires, you would almost always get the same answer. The difference is, I think, you know, that historically they've happened at different times. So obviously in America, it really takes off first, and you get this kind of interwar period where you see the mass proliferation of cars, and really not getting there until after World War II in Europe. It's quite surprising how late kind of the automobilization of Europe happens. And then of course, elsewhere, we wait a little bit more. So we kind of see the car and people going through the motions of the mass adoption of the car. When places reach a certain amount of wealth, and you know, cities develop and so on and so on. But yeah, I think that's maybe a disappointing answer, but it's also very interesting that it's more or less the same everywhere, I think.
It all has something to do with helping to shape the identity that we want to be individually, and I guess collectively as a society. We've had quite a few questions coming in here, and I'll start with one that I know is from a car guy that asked his question very early on.
Can I just say apologies if I get any dates, names, or facts wrong?
You will be forgiven. So,
okay.
You know, I'm not quite sure where he's going with this question, but he starts out with you know, noting that you mentioned the idea of speed as enticing the general public at the beginning of the 20th century. I guess he wants you to reflect a little bit more on your opinion about the automobile and the environment. Is there a role that the car can play in improving the environment, or is it always the fault of the car?
I mean, there's no denying that the car has contributed to some of the problems that we're experiencing today. And what has been so interesting, even in the last 2 years of working on this exhibition, is the speed at which car companies are pivoting right now. Maybe not as much in America, but definitely in Europe. In places like Germany, a country that itself is very obsessed with high performance vehicles, the speed at which they are putting out lines of electric cars. Companies like McLaren thinking of electric. So, you know, the environment question is, I don't think there is a doubt that you will see a massive proliferation of electric coming out. Whether or not that will fully address some of the problems, there's a lot of debate, but I think it's probably a shift in the right direction. And the other thing is, I think, you know, that the automobile, you know, everything in moderation is good for the body. So, you know, you can be very environmentally kind of forward thinking and not have to give up the idea that we'll have to throw out the automobile altogether. But a return to more diversity in how we get around, and the automobile becoming just one of many different ways, will already be, I think, a big substantial shift on that front. I don't know if we wanted to get into the environmental debate, but you know, I think the point is it often gets polarized, and I think there's a middle ground that's interesting and worth looking at.
Yeah. One of the question goes back maybe to the first one. And again, this, you're coming to the Detroit area to do research. You came here to Cranbrook, obviously.
Yeah.
You're at the Ruther. Any changes in your shift in thinking once you came to Detroit in the midst of this project?
About Detroit, or?
Well, I think about the exhibition, and was there a shift in your curatorial perspective at all?
Well, I mean, we relied. I think there are probably, 30% of the objects in the show are probably from Detroit. So that's already significant. What I think was really interesting about, I had been to Detroit before, but never spent, so much time in the city, and especially looking at the automobile industry there, but also, going to institutions like yourself and the DIA, and to the universities, the Ruther Library, that I think the image of Detroit often gets boiled down to kind of a very basic one of the big three. And automobile manufacturer being all about these massive companies, the car and the worker. And what gets lost in that story is an incredible creative melting pot of different individuals and institutions who were feeding into each other's interests. So, I have a background in product and furniture design. And so this whole notion that you've got an institution like Cranbrook, which is on the one hand is kind of developing the future Eameses and Saarinen of the world, and on the other hand, is feeding into automobile production. I think essentially Detroit is this nexus between a broader world of applied arts and design and car design, and the applied arts part and the way that connects to car design gets lost a lot in the narrative.
Yeah, I mean, it's also been interesting that in more recent decades, we haven't seen as much involvement between the artists coming out of Cranbrook and the automobile industry. It really was this rich period in the mid-century modern era, and perhaps not as much anymore, but that's probably something for another research project. There are 3 or 4 questions here that are asking you to maybe reflect on, and I have a feeling that you might have a personal perspective on this, but car ownership, kind of the allure of the automobile, is not the same for some of the younger generations as it was for people of my generation. My daughter, living in Minneapolis, although she very proudly learned to drive a manual shift on her parents' cars, does not own a car, has no desire to own a car, is adamant that any city she lives in, it's got to have a good mass transportation system. Did you address that at all in the exhibition, or maybe you can just offer some reflections on this generational shift that's going on?
Yeah, I've thought about it a lot, and no, we don't directly reference it in the exhibition, except for this notion, which is the notion of in terms of selling the car, which became incredibly popular, especially in the post-war period, where the car became this extension of your personality. And so it became very important for you to show your car to your peers. The whole idea of lowriders in Los Angeles was low and slow. So you'd go down the avenue and everybody would see you and they'd admire your work. So, the car was the second most important purchase you would make in your lifetime next to your house. And so at that time, it very much defined who you were. And, when we talk about the newer generations and those kind of, what are the spaces of appearance in which they define their personalities and who they are, that's all taking place online. And so, it's much more attractive to have a picture of yourself in or in front of a fancy looking car than it is to shilling out the money to actually buy one. And so it's really no surprise that what you're seeing a lot nowadays is the rise in rental experiences, rented experiences. So you don't need to buy a McLaren. You can now spend £20,000, which is still a ridiculous amount of money. And you can race a McLaren on a subscription fee for 10 times a year or something like that. So what you're seeing is, yeah, the ownership of products is less important because the way we show off to our peers has changed. It's no longer about being on the street, but it's about being online. I would say that's my guess as an armchair anthropologist.
Hmm. So what kind of car do you own, Brendan?
I feel like that's a planted question. I don't own a car at all. And the dirty secret of this whole exhibition is I don't have a driver's license either. Not out of any kind of specific ideology, but just out of an accident in history that it never happened.
I'll ask one more question that kind of is looking to the future, and then end with a couple of more specifics about the exhibition itself. Very recently, China has eclipsed the US as the largest auto market. What would this exhibition look like 20 years from now?
Oh, I mean, oh God. Well, I told you at the beginning that I wouldn't predict what the future would look like, but I have a feeling that, so in 20 years, what's going to happen is you're going to get a kind of splitting somehow. And the car industry is going to go in two directions. One direction is going to be towards autonomous vehicles, which are rented. And so, half of the exhibition will look like very plain, not very enticing looking, but sleek, something like an iPhone, kind of vehicles for bringing people around, because you don't own them. You just want something that looks relatively good, but it doesn't have to be flashy. So that's one direction. And the second direction is going to go kind of back in time to that early motoring history, where the car becomes a niche hobby for individuals who are really into the topic. And there you're going to see, all the bells and whistles and all and that kind of stuff. So it's going to go in two directions.
Okay.
Maybe.
Thank you for looking into your crystal ball. So there's a question here, a very specific one about the exhibition, and I must admit I was a little perplexed myself. Tell us again the relationship between the animal carcass and the Model T Ford that you presented in the exhibition there.
Yeah, so when Henry Ford was trying to think about how to rearrange his factory to become more efficient, he was looking at slaughterhouses. And so there is several films that he commissioned, which were study films, studying the way pigs were slaughtered. And what the modern day, or what his invention of the assembly line was a reversal of what he saw at the slaughterhouse, which was an animal being disassembled along the line. So we call that whole section from disassembly to assembly.
I see. Thank you. It was probably clear in your presentation, but thank you for just elaborating a little bit. And, another Cranbrook connection, because there are a lot of them out there in the world, right? So you mentioned that Henry Ford had a sociological department. That was actually originally headed by an Episcopalian minister who was at St. Paul's in Detroit, by the name of Samuel Marquis. He eventually got disillusioned by Henry Ford and this grand experience, wrote kind of a tell-all book that tried to reveal some of Henry Ford's problems. Henry Ford tried to get it off the market as quickly as possible. And then he came to work for George Booth here at Cranbrook, and was the person that worked with him to really realized the building of Christ Church Cranbrook, and served as the first head of Christ Church Cranbrook. So there's a lot of interesting connections. So I want to just end with just some specifics that people are asking about the exhibition. When we were talking a couple of days ago, you were telling us about the plans to travel the exhibition and how that has changed. So will people have a chance to see the exhibition now that it has officially closed at the V&A?
Well, the short answer is no. There were some plans to travel. Well, in the near future, the short answer is no, I should say. So there were some plans for it to travel to America. Actually, it was supposed to be there now, but that got pushed back and eventually shelved for a little bit. We will think of kind of how to do a reduced version of the show with the V&A material that we have, but it's incredibly challenging right now, and nobody knows when museums will open, so it's incredibly hard to put things in the books, unfortunately.
Yeah. And then finally, tell us just a little bit more about the book that accompanies the exhibition. I mean, it's not a catalog per se. I think it kind of goes beyond the exhibition, but maybe you can make a bit of a plug for Cars Accelerating the Modern World, the book.
I would love to. In fact, just today it was listed in the Financial Times as one of the books of the summer of 2020. So I was very happy about that. Yes, it is, on the one hand, it is a kind of a catalog of the exhibition, but it's also a space to go into much more detail. So we have 6 chapters written by the curatorial team, which are very much kind of historical accounts looking at the threads that I was mentioning here, and also 6 essays from guest authors reflecting on their personal experiences with automobiles.
What's the range of these perspectives? Are they mostly European perspectives? Any perspectives from our side of the Atlantic?
We do have one writer from California who wrote a great piece on. She works a lot actually with pedestrian advocacy, and so she ends the piece with a thing called "There Are No Cars in Wakanda." So where I talk about all these science fiction imagery using the car and putting the car in kind of the front row frame. One of the most recent examples of science fiction we have is Black Panther, and in Black Panther, the mythical city of Wakanda actually is a car-free society. So she's wondering perhaps it'll go that way. We also have an author from Kenya looking at the failed attempts at producing a national car in Kenya, and the rest are from Britain, if I am correct. I'm not. Yes.
Well, thank you. I can vouch for the catalog. I think it is definitely worthwhile putting your hands on for anybody that is interested. And just my last comment here is going to be to a few of you in the audience that when we thought this was going to be a live lecture here at Cranbrook back in April, purchased the books. This has been, like so many things in this era of the pandemic, difficult to get our hands on some of those books here at Cranbrook. But when we checked on Friday, they were making their way and they promised delivery of them this week. So those of you that are there in the audience that bought the catalog through us here at Cranbrook, stay tuned. We'll be sending out an email to just those of you that already pre-purchased it, and set up something in July when there'll be a contact-less opportunity for you to maybe pull up in front of Cranbrook House, show us your automobile, and one of us will put it in your trunk and you can drive away. So Brendan, thank you so much for joining us virtually but live today. So many people were disappointed when we had to cancel. I mean, I think was relatively early in the pandemic. You know, we were still kind of wondering, well, should we do it? Shouldn't we do it? And then, you know, initially we were all thinking, we'll just put this off until September, and we'll all be able to gather safely, 200 of us packed into Sal Auditorium to watch you there. And now with the uncertainties of international travel and the uncertainties of this virus, I think it was wise that we decided to not wait any longer and just do it virtually today. So thank you again for joining us, those of you in the audience. And it's actually been pretty amazing to see how there's been very little drop off from the beginning of this webinar to the end. So we obviously have a group of people that are very interested in the car and what it means in our society. Thank you again, Brendan, and thank you to all of our participants. We look forward to either welcoming you back to Cranbrook or sharing another virtual experience with you. So goodbye. Thank you.